Alrighty, so moving on here, we're going to start editing our render in Photoshop. So the first thing we need to do, of course, is open it. So we're going to go to File, Open, and we're going to open up our render that came out of Rhino here. So we'll select that, click Open, and it's going to open up our render into a new Photoshop file. So probably the first thing you want to do is save it. So we're going to do File, Save As, just give it a name here. Well, I guess we'll name it correctly here. Project 05 Photoshop. We want to make sure that we're saving it as a Photoshop file. This is the working file that we're going to be using, but at the end here you probably would want to also save, in addition to saving as a Photoshop file, you'll want to save it as a JPEG, which is just we'll merge all the layers together to produce the final render. So we'll save our Photoshop file here. The next thing we want to do is we want to unlock our layer here. It by default opens up as locked, and we just want to unlock that. And then we're going to want to rename our layer. So to do that, you just simply double click here on the name layer 0, and we're going to type in SVC, Stonehenge Visitor Center. That's going to be this layer. The next thing we're going to do is if your toolbars aren't set up here like they are for me, one thing you want to check here is go under the Windows tab here, go down to Workspace, and make sure that you're in the Essentials workspace setup. If you are and it's not quite right, you can always reset your Essentials, which is the default workspace, and then close Photoshop, open it back up, and it will probably be fixed. If you're still having issues, then of course ask us questions and we will answer them and figure that out for you. So the first thing we want to do here, typically in Photoshop you want to work from the back of the image to the front. So what I mean by that is essentially we're going to start compositing, which is this section of the tutorial. We're going to start by bringing in a background, a sky in this instance. So that's going to be our first step here, and then after that we're going to add in some vegetation, and then we'll add in some people, and then we will do post-processing in the next tutorial. So likely your render has come in with a transparent background. I'm not sure if we told all of you, but we did say to export your render with the transparent background. If you have not done that, it's not a worry at all. There are a couple other ways we can do that. If you have the alpha channel, which just shows which elements of this render are objects and which are background, you can use that to erase the background. The other thing you can do is use the lasso tool to sort of select all of the bits in this image that are sky, and then use a layer mask to get rid of those parts. So how we would start is, so now that we have our file open, the first thing we're going to do is, in terms of compositing, is we're going to put in a sky. So in Photoshop typically we work from the back of the image or the background, and work forward from that. So we'll start by bringing in a sky, and then we obviously have our building in here already, so that's sort of the middle ground. and then we'll add in some vegetation, and then lastly we'll add in some people. And then in the next tutorial we'll do a little bit of post-processing, post-processing to sort of bring all of these elements together. So there's a couple ways to remove the sky here. You guys should have a transparent background on your Rhino render. So instead of this blue area like I have here, yours should just be transparent or white. So when you bring it in, it will probably have this checkered background sort of happening instead of this blue color. So the other option that you have is to use an alpha, which is a channel in the render, which specifies in terms of black and white which elements are in the background, which are shown in black, and which objects are actual objects in Rhino, which are shown in white here. So what you can do if you have the alpha channel is you can drag this. All you have to do, and this actually goes for all of the compositing, you can place images in Photoshop, but I like to just drag them and move them into the Photoshop file so that all of the elements are in there. So what I'm going to do first is unlock the layer over here that contains our alpha channel, and I'm just going to use the selection tool, this crosshair here. I'm just going to click and drag the alpha channel up over into the tab. I still have the mouse held down here, and I'm just going to let go in space. You can see that it's put the alpha channel behind our building. So again, like I was saying before, that means it's behind our SVC image here, and you can see if I turn that layer off, which is this eyeball tool here, allows you to turn layers on and off. You can see that our alpha channel is back there, and we actually want it to the front for right now. So I'm going to just drag it, just click and drag the layer and bring it forward. And then I'm going to drag this image up into the corner so that it's perfectly aligned. You can see that there, perfectly aligned with the render. And this is really crucial because I'm essentially going to use this as a template to cut out the bits of sky. So now what you want to do is close out of this guy here. What you want to do is save, just have a save point, and you're probably going to want to save pretty frequently just to make sure that you don't lose your work. So we're going to name our Photoshop file here, make sure that we're saving it as a Photoshop file. Click save and save that. The next thing you want to do also is make sure that you're naming your layers. That's probably the first thing you want to do as soon as you bring a new image into Photoshop, is make sure that you're layering it. So we'll call this alpha. I've already named our render as SVC. You can name it building or visitor center, doesn't matter, as long as it's something that describes what's on the layer. So what I'm going to do here is demonstrate this thing called a layer mask, and we're going to be using the layer mask a lot. Essentially what it is hiding certain parts of the image and hiding it instead of erasing it is really the logic here that we're using. So if I was to use the eraser tool, right, I could come in here and I could start erasing the sky just like this. The problem with this is I'm literally deleting all of this information from our Photoshop file. So if I was to, do this and save it, save the Photoshop file and open it up tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to undo this erasing. All of this information is gone permanently forever, unless I undo right now. But again, if I saved it, closed out, opened it up tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to revert back to this. So if I, messed up here and erased part of the building and I didn't notice it until tomorrow, there's no way that I would be able to fix that issue. I would have to bring in this image again or start over completely. So using the eraser or deleting elements of the photo or photos permanently is called destructive editing, and that just means that you're destroying information and making a permanent change. But what we want to do is called constructive editing, and basically that just means that later on, even if we save and close out of Photoshop, we can still edit things later because we haven't actually deleted or permanently removed any information. We've only hidden it from what we can see, essentially. So how that works is, so you saw the example of the eraser. So what we need to do if we want to do constructive editing and get rid of this sky is we need to have a layer mask here. And so here at the bottom of the right hand panel, you can see there's some options. You can create a new layer, delete layer, make a group, add an adjustment layer, effects, linking, and we have this black rectangle with a white circle in the middle. This is the adjustment layer tool. So if you click on that, when you have the layer selected that you want to add a layer mask to, you're just going to select that layer, come down here, click this icon, the black rectangle with the white circle, and it's going to add a layer mask which looks just like this. And it's going to have this linkage between them, which you can see here, and the layer mask is going to come in as white, or as a white sheet essentially. So the way the layer mask works is it uses grayscale to show or hide information and anything in between. So by it being white right now, white means that we can see all of the information. Black means that we won't see any information. So for example, if I filled this layer mask with black, and you'll notice too that you can select between the actual layer and the layer mask. This is important to note when you are filling or painting or something like that. Make sure that you're on the layer mask and not on the layer. There's a difference, and you will notice that. So if I was to fill or paint, let's use the paint brush here. If I was to paint this entire layer mask black, you can see that it's removing all of the information, right? Just like that. And if I use the white color here with the paintbrush, you can see I'm starting to bring that information back into Photoshop. So this is really a really useful and important component to Photoshop, and you're likely going to be using it all of the time. Every time that you're in Photoshop, you'll be using a layer mask. So it's important that you know how to do this, and it's very crucial for this assignment. So remember that black is to hide information and white is to show it. And again, you can see here that if you look at the white box for the layer mask, if I start to paint black, you can see that shape that I've done in black right there. So it also kind of shows you just sort of a little bit of information about what exactly you're hiding in what areas. So at any rate, what we want to do essentially is use black paint to get rid of the blue parts here. We want to hide the sky. And so you maybe can already kind of see how that's coming to play here. If we want to use black to get rid of this sky, you'll notice on the alpha channel that the building is white already and the sky is black, right? What we're going to do is we're going to use this tool called color select, or color range select, and what that's going to let us do is to select only the black in this photo. And you can use this in other ways, this color range select, and I'll show you that when we get to post-processing. It just allows you to select any specific type of color, and you know, you usually use it in conjunction with the layer mask. But at any rate, what we're going to do is we're just going to select the black in this photo. So what you're going to do is turn off your SVC layer and make sure that just your alpha layer is on. We can delete this actually. Just the alpha layer is on. And the reason being is we only want to select the color that's in this photo, not what is in the photo behind it. So also make sure your alpha channel is selected, the alpha layer, and you're going to come up here to the top of this, the top left hand of the screen, and go to the select tab and use color range select, which is right here. So what it's going to do is you're going to notice you have this eyedropper tool, and that means we're looking to select some colors here. You have this thing called fuzziness, which is just kind of sort of specifying the accuracy of your selection, and that's pretty much all you need to know here. So we're going to zoom in here so we can see the edge of our building and make sure we get all of these black pixels and dark gray pixels. So I'm going to start clicking. I'm going to hold shift. You can see that when I hold shift there's a little plus sign next to the eyedropper, so that's just adding more colors to the selection. So I'm just going to click on these gray colors just like that. It takes a little bit of guesswork, sometimes some trial and error here. I'm just going to set the fuzziness to 92 because I think that's probably going to get me the results that I want. So once I have selected my pixels and I've selected or specified the fuzziness, I'm just going to press OK, and you can see here that there's this dashed line now in Photoshop, and this just shows you that there are regions that are selected right now. And so now we can turn off the alpha layer and go back to our render, and you can see now that all of the regions that are blue have been selected, right? So you can see that there. And so what we want to do is, the next step is we want to fill these regions that we've selected with black, right? So that way we can get rid of that or hide that information for right now. So what we're going to do next is we're going to use the fill tool, which is under edit, and we're going to make sure first that we have our layer mask selected here, the white box. So make sure you've selected that. You're going to come up to again to the top left, go to edit, and then fill, which is just a little bit above midway down the menu here. You can also use the hotkeys Shift F5, and you're going to click on that, and you're going to get this little menu. Under contents, we want to do black, right? Because we want this information to disappear. So we're going to use black. You can notice you can also use white. You can specify any color really, but for layer masks we're probably just going to be using black and white and maybe some grays. The mode should be set to normal, so make sure that's the same, and opacity set to 100. And once we do that, we're going to click OK here to fill our layer mask with black. We're going to press OK, and you can see now that all of that information has gone away, right? So now what we're left with is that checkered background, and that just means that there's no information back there right now. That's just the base background in Photoshop. So this is what we want. All of the sky is gone now. So we still have this selected region, but we don't need it anymore. So what we're going to do is Control D, which is deselect. It's not escape like it is in Rhino. So remember that Control D is deselect. So I'm going to do that right now. Control D, and we've deselected those regions. Okay, so we don't need our alpha channel right now. And if your render came in like this in the first place, then you know, that's great, and you don't have to do this step. But it is important that you know how to use the layer mask and color range select, and this was a good example of how to do that. So at any rate, we have our background out now, the blue. So now we're going to bring in a sky, and so what I'm going to do here, typically you want to get sky images off of Google. Like you can get different textures for renders off of Google Images. You can also do the same thing for sky backgrounds. You will notice here that I have taken this render sort of at a sunset angle here. So I'm going to put in an evening sky, and I have already downloaded some from the internet, so I'm just going to open those up. Go to that folder. It's probably good practice that you guys sort of have a folder for all of these textures and objects and backgrounds that you're going to be putting in Photoshop. So you can see here I have a collection of sky, people that I've cut out or are going to cut out, vehicles, stuff like that. It's a little bit unorganized because I have sort of these more organized folders up here, but anyway, so I'm going to look here for a photo that I want to put in the background here. You can see that I'm using very high quality backgrounds, and you're going to want to either match or have larger pixel dimensions for the background photo than what you have for the render. If you have a render that's 4,000 pixels but your background is 1,000 pixels, obviously your background is going to be really pixelated and it's going to look really bad. So make sure that your background is of the same or higher quality. My render in Photoshop right now is 8,000 pixels, and you can see here that this image is 16,000, so it's much larger, over twice the size, and that's good. So I can move it around and have a little bit of wiggle room to place in the sky. So this is the background image that I'm going to use here. I guess I'm kind of lucky. It's already sort of this pastoral setting. So in this case, so is the SVC, and I probably won't have to do a whole lot of changing of the background because of that. But yeah, anyway, so evening sky, and I'm just going to, again, like before, just drag it, click, drag up into this other tab here, and release in this Photoshop file here. So you can see here that the sky is on top of the building. So sort of what I'm going to do first is just move it around generally, and then I'm going to take the background layer. First I'm going to rename it background. Could name it sky or whatever. And then I'm going to drag it below our building, so you can see now, because we've erased the blue background that was there before, now we can place in this image here. So one thing to note too, as you're moving or trying to manipulate this background, you might want to scale it down, you might want to flip it like I was just doing. To do that, there's a couple options. You can either go to edit, the edit tab here, when you have the layer selected with the object you're trying to transform. Then you go to edit, and then you go down here to transform. It's a little bit below midway. And you can see you have a couple options here. You can flip it, you can rotate, warp, perspective, distort. These are like more complex ways of manipulating the image. And of course you have scale and rotation. The other thing you can do instead of going to edit is you can just do Control T, which is a hotkey, and that will get you to the transform options very quickly. So I can do Control T, and if I right click, you can see here that I have those same transform options because I'm sort of in this transform setting here where I need to be transforming the image. I can scale, rotate, do all those same things. So I can flip it just like that. I can do skew if I wanted to. We'll get into some of these a little bit later, but at any rate, so I've scaled it down a little bit, and I'm just going to really move this image down a little bit here. Just get it until it's the way that I want it to look. So that looks pretty good to me. So that's how you put in a sky. And in compositing with other things like vegetation and people is going to be pretty much exactly the same. You're just going to open it, drag it into this Photoshop file, and then you might need to do a little bit of manipulating, transforming, or layer mask to sort of get things to look right. So now we have our background in. The next step here for us is going to be to put in the vegetation. So some of you might have rendered your ground with grass already. That's fine. We're basically just going to cover it up here in Photoshop, or at least that is what I'm going to show you guys how to do to make the grass much more realistic looking. We'll also put in some pathways here, and yeah, get into people and trees and stuff. So at any rate, what I'm going to do again, if you don't have sort of these vegetation components or people and stuff, go to Google Images. I'm just going to keep on reiterating that. Frequently I use images of spaces that I've taken pictures of. So for example, here I'm going to use some images of grass that I've taken before. So let's open this guy here. So you can see here in this image, and again, maybe you download something like this right off of the internet. I'm just going to take this area of grass in front of the pathway here. I'm just going to cut that out, and I'm going to bring it into our Photoshop file here. So first thing I need to do, of course, unlock the layer. Now I'm going to use the Polygon lasso tool. So you can see here, if you have the lasso tool, you just right click, expand the menu, Polygon lasso. It's just going to let me draw a box or some type of shape here. I'm just going to select this region that I want to cut out, and I drew this region just by clicking points and then coming back and meeting at the point where I started. You can also double click and it will close the polygon here. So once I have this region selected, you can see with the dashed line, I'm going to use our move tool here, and you can see on the area that I haven't selected that it's just the normal crosshair next to the mouse cursor. As I move into this dashed region, you can see that it's turned to a pair of scissors. So it already knows that am trying to cut this part of the image out. So I'm going to click on that, drag it just like the sky into our Photoshop file here. So you can see I have this chunk of grass now in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do now, after I rename this here as grass, maybe I want to be a little more specific if I have more grass. We'll call it short grass. So what I'm going to do, as you can probably see here, our grass piece doesn't really fit into the image here nicely. The way that I cut it doesn't match. So there are obviously some gaps we need to fill in over here with this same image. So you could duplicate this image and move it around. It probably wouldn't look very good if you did it that way. It would look sloppy. So this is where the clone stamp tool is going to come into play. So I'm going to show you guys how that works. So we have our patch of grass, and essentially what we want to do is take parts of this patch of grass and put it over here. And in this case we're going to essentially be painting it over in this region. So we can have smooth edges and just have a little bit more control over the scale of things and how it looks. So what you want to do is, you know, just kind of place this grass patch sort of in generally the right place. You can zoom in here, sort of look at the scale of the grass blades. Maybe I need to actually scale this down because the grass is too large up front here. It's not to scale with the render, so I can use Control T, right? Click the corner, hold Shift and drag to scale our grass down. So this looks a little bit better here. Once I get it how I want, I can double click. So you can see now I've resized that image, scaled it down. And now I'm going to use the clone stamp tool here to paint parts of these in other areas of the photo. So how a clone stamp works, first you need to be on the layer that you're going to be clone stamping with. Then you need to select the clone stamp tool. You'll see here that you have this circle paintbrush. You could use different paintbrushes, but for what we're doing, we're just going to leave the circle here. You might only want to specify sort of the size of it. Because of our image being sort of long and not very tall, probably going to use a smaller brush so we don't get these edges into our clone stamping. And I'm going to set the hardness to 0 so everything kind of melts together. So once you set up the brush, you're going to use the Alt key, and I believe, well, on Macs it will be different. I forget exactly what it is, but you're going to use the Alt key, and you can see when I hold down Alt, it changes the cursor to this smaller circle with crosshairs. What this is letting you know is that you're supposed to select a region. It's asking you to select a region. And that region is going to be sort of whatever is in this circle paintbrush. So whatever you can see in this paintbrush is going to be the region that you're selecting. So you hold down Alt, click the area that you want to clone stamp. Let's do this guy right here. Right? So you can see here I selected this region. Let's see if I can, this region. And you can see now that I can paint this region anywhere that I want. And it's not just going to be a repeat of this region. It's going to take, you'll see, watch this region here where I've used the Alt key and click. Watch that area as I start to paint over here. Watch what happens. You can see just barely there's this other cursor that started at that region, and it's moving as I paint new regions. So you can see this hard edge is now starting to end up over here. So this is something to keep in mind. You don't want a hard edge because then it doesn't look natural, right? It looks like you have duplicated two images and sort of glued them together, and that's not what we want. So you just need to, sort of be mindful of where these edges are and pick regions that are not super close to edges. And then when you get to an edge, of course, you can just select another region and sort of fill in here. So you can see that I'm painting in elements of this photo into other parts of the render here. And if you guys are struggling with this bit, don't worry. We can go over it in lab, and you guys can ask as many questions as you like. I'm just kind of randomly painting in here. And just that sort of randomness makes it look more realistic, right? As you can see, I filled in this area. Let's add a little bit more over here. I'm going to paint more than what we need. And the reason is, of course, with the layer mask, we can come in and hide that information. It's better to have more at the beginning and then sort of come back and start to adjust and remove some of that information than it is to not have enough at the beginning. So you can see here that I've clone stamped much above where I need to be, way over this concrete pad. But it's okay because I'm just going to come back and clean that up. So now that I've done that, the next step, of course, is going to be to sort of refine that edge and bring it back down to the level of the building and make it look like grass blades. You can see here it's just kind of like fading off into the distance. It doesn't look like a bunch of grass at this edge here. So what we're going to do is sort of remove some of this information, bring it back, and then we're going to use the paintbrush and the layer mask to make the edges look like grass blades. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So what we're going to do now that we've used the clone stamp and we're done with that, we're going to add a layer mask, of course, the black rectangle with white circle. You can see that's popped up here. Now we're going to use the paintbrush on the left side of the screen. You're just going to select that guy, bring it in here. You're going to want to set the size to, I don't know, maybe, of course it depends sort of on the size of your render. I'm going to set it to 1000, I think. That's pretty good, yeah. And set the hardness to 0, because we're sort of going to blend this edge and make it look much better. So I'm going to set that to 0. And now what I'm going to do, also make sure that our color for the paintbrush is set to black, because we're trying to remove some information first. And I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to start painting. Just start painting this edge. I actually want to set this brush size a little bit lower here. I'm just going to use the black and I'm going to start painting this edge here. Just getting rid of some of that info. Same here with the building. It's okay if you're not perfect right now, that's fine, because we can always adjust it. You might need to adjust the paintbrush size in some areas here, just like that. Come back in with the I notice I'm flipping between black and white here with this little arrow. allows me to flip the colors really quickly instead of having to change it between black and white all the time. I'm going to use the lasso tool here because I can't really see this edge of the pad here, so I'm going to use the lasso tool to kind of trace out that region and then fill it with black. So you can see here, just using the lasso tool. Just following the edge of the concrete here. Just like that. Now I'll come back here and connect it with the end so you can see that region is selected, that top of the concrete. You can see, yeah, I can't really see it because of the grass, so what I'm going to do is just fill that region on the layer mask with black so you can see now. I can see that area, I can see what it looks like. And then I'm going to come back with the paintbrush. Just kind of do this a little bit. Come back in with the white. Just make sure it's below sort of the top edge there so we can add in our grass. Something like that. So you can see now we're starting to blend this edge, make it look like the grass is running up to the building. So you guys can see sort of the difference between these two now. So the next thing we want to do is, like I was saying, just make this edge look more like grass blades. So how we're going to do that is use you just right click when you have the paintbrush selected. You're going to right click and you can select this grass blade here. There's also sort of these 3 grass blades. You can see that right there, or the single one. We're going to use these 3 grass blades for this. It doesn't really matter, just personal preference. Of course, we need to adjust the size as well. So probably maybe 67 is good. This takes a little bit of trial and error as well. Also, I forgot to mention this. Of course, when you're painting with black and white, make sure that you're on the layer mask and not on the photo. If you're on the photo, you're going to be painting black all over the place, like actual black paint, and we don't want that. We want to use the black to hide information, so make sure you're on the layer mask. One thing that's different here with the grass paintbrush is it uses 2 colors at the same time to paint with. So if you're using like if you had like a green and a black, or 2 green colors, and you're just using this to paint colors, it would have a variety of green colors. I'm assuming that's the purpose of using the 2 colors. So if I was to do this right now with a white and a black, it would start to hide in certain areas and show in other areas, sort of this mix matching, and we don't want that. We want to just use the grass to show this grassy image. So we're going to set both of our colors to white, and then we're going to start using the grass brush here. So you can see already it's making these little grass shapes, and that's just really making a realistic grassy edge for us. So we're just going to be doing this, just running it along the edges here, the edges of the concrete. And again, you can always readjust this because we're using a layer mask. don't have to be perfect. You know, the way that the grass grows and the ground isn't perfect either. So actually a little bit of variation in size and height makes it look more realistic. So you can see how I'm doing that here. Just run it over here as well. Just like that. I'm going to run the paintbrush over here as well to show the grass. Change the brush size, and then I'm going to come back and make sure that we can again see that edge of the concrete. I'll just use the Polygon lasso tool and fill that region with black, just as I was doing before, just like that. So then we'll come back in with the lasso tool here, select that area. I don't want to get too close to this edge because I don't want to cut the pieces of grass that are sort of going over the edge there. So like that. And then we'll fill that region with black. Again, we're working on our layer mask and not on the actual layer. So there we go. You can see we have this grassy edge along our foundation here. So if you wanted to add in more grass, it's the same process. You might use the clone stamp tool. You'll probably use the layer mask, etc., sort of to get that to look correctly. So, alrighty. Okay, so I'm going to add in also this rocky pathway, just sort of with the same process here. So I'm going to open up some or an image that has some rocks here. I think this one is going to be pretty good. Let's try it out. So again, I'm just going to unlock it here, drag it in. You can see it's far too large here for what we're trying to do. So I'm just going to size it down a little bit here. I'm going to use the clone stamp again to paint in these. Actually, first I'm going to scale this down more. Yeah, something like that. And then I will use the clone stamp again. So something like this. You can already start to see it taking shape here. And then we don't need this at all, so I'm actually going to just get rid of that guy. Okay, so we have our rocks here for the pathway, and again we're going to use a layer mask to sort of blend these edges together. First I'm going to get rid of this top portion. Just erase that guy. And then what I'm going to do is, on this edge, I'm going to use the grass brush again, and the black to sort of use the grass brush to remove some information here. And on the other side, I'll use a different brush to make it look rocky. So here, because on this side, you know, the grass would be taller than the rocks, so it would look something sort of like this. See how that's looking. this edge I might use one of these other brushes. There's a variety of them. You can sort of click on them and sort of see what they look like. But I'm going to use it as a splotchy brush, sort of get rid of some of this info here, just make it look more natural and really blend these edges together. Something like this, right? You have this rocky pathway going up. Okay, so now I'm going to add in some trees. We're going to move on to trees and people. And again, it's much the same process, right? First, you probably need to go onto the internet and download some people and trees. And when you're getting those people and trees, and we can talk about this in lab as well, where to or how to find these, but you want to search for PNGs, and a PNG is going to mean that this white background is actually not there at all. So all of the white that you see here is just going to be nothing. There will be no information. So it will make more sense when I open up a thing here. So I'm going to use this tree. So you can see I've opened it and it has that checkerboard background, which means that there's no white, no nothing back there. So again, I'm just going to drag this in and release it. You can see it's too big here, so we can scale it down. Typically you don't want to put vegetation in front of the building because then you can't see the building. If you are sort of using Photoshop to render your landscape, maybe that's not quite the case and you do have vegetation in front there, if you're doing some other artistic thing, but for the most part we want to see your building, so don't hide it with trees. So I've placed this tree and I use the transform to scale it down. And so instead of opening other ones, I could just duplicate this tree, right? I could just copy and paste it. So to do that, copy and paste is not the same in Photoshop. What you're going to need to do is use duplicate, and how you do that is on the layer that has the tree, and we should probably name this tree, and we should name our pathway or gravel path. On the layer you want to copy and paste, you just right click on it. At the top here you can see this duplicate layer option. You just click on that and it's going to bring up this little menu to rename it. So maybe it's 02, and you hit enter, and now you can see that I have a duplicate of this tree that I can paste and transform and scale down in the background here. And I can do the same thing, duplicate that tree. I'll move it further, another one back here. And again, pay attention when you duplicate, it's going to make the new layer on top of the original, so you can see that this small tree is on top of the big tree, right? Well, it needs to be opposite because this tree is in the background, so it's actually going to go down to the bottom there. You can just drag it, and same with this guy. Just drag those trees around just like that. So you probably notice like the tree trunk is, I want this tree to be behind the foundation, but it's not. I could move it down here below SVC, but then we wouldn't have all of our trees sort of in the same region. So we're going to come back to these guys and use the layer mask once again, right? So we can sort of remove this part of the trunk that's behind the foundation. So I'm going to add a layer mask. I'm going to use our black paintbrush here. And I'm just going to get rid of that. Just like that. I need to do the same for this one. Paint him black. Get rid of that tree trunk. You can do that too to blend. You can do that to all of these to sort of blend the tree trunk into the ground instead of having this sort of very hard edge. Something like that. And there you go. Maybe you want to add another tree over to the other side here. Just like that. Alrighty. So now we can add in some people, and actually maybe before we do that we can group, all of these are trees, so sort of to clean up our layering we can use the group here, which is this folder icon. Just click that and it will make it into a group. We can name this group trees. So if I turn the group off, it will turn all of the trees off, right? And maybe now's a good time to add a broader group as well. This one we can call landscape. And our landscape will have the trees in it. It will have our gravel pathway. Oops. And it will have our grass, right? Just like that. There we go. Okay. So now we can add in some people. And again, people, you're gonna have to get them off of the internet. There are some websites you can go to. Google Images, of course, is always a good place. And you're gonna be looking for PNG people. So you can see here, I have quite a collection already of people to put in into the file here. So I'm just going to start doing that. You're just going to start opening them, dragging them in, right? Scaling them down. This takes a little bit of eyeballing really to sort of see what the correct size is. And then you want to rename these. Do that. I'll just put a couple in here. You guys can put in as many as you want. Typically you want to show how this building is going to be used, and typically that means or that refers also to sort of the how many people are going to be using this building. Is it, you know, a huge public space? Is it a sort of very specific building that people don't come here all too often for? Whatever it may be, but you should reflect sort of that functionality in terms of like the people that you show in the render and how many people are in there. So I'm going to use these people sort of up front. That's just sort of a stylistic thing that I like to do. Let's see. I'll put this guy in there as well. And we'll put in some people further back who are using the building. One thing to note too, that you can see these people have the lighting on them, and their shadow is very evident. It stands out a lot. So I have the sun angle coming in from out of frame. You can see how it's coming in based on these shadows here, and it doesn't match these people. So usually you want to sort of either pick people that do match the lighting scene, or you can sort of manipulate them. You can see I just flip them around, and it's a little bit better in terms of how they match the lighting, but that's always something to keep in mind as well. Put them in there, and just a couple more people. Okay, so there we go. We have a number of people in here. So the next thing you want to do, it's a sunny day, you know, people are going to have shadows. It's be kind of weird if they didn't. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in some shadows to these people, and essentially how that's going to work is I'm just going to duplicate this guy. I'm going to make him completely black, and then sort of manipulate his shape so that it lies on the ground sort of as a shadow would. So the first step to doing that is select the person you want to have a shadow, make their shadow. So I'm going to select this guy. I'm going to duplicate him, so there are now 2 of him. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, I can use really any of these guys, but I'm going to use the exposure adjustment layer, and I'm going to, you can see here that as I move the slider around, it's making most of the scene darker, which isn't what we want. We just want to make the guy darker. So how you do that with adjustment layers, make the adjustment layer only affect a certain layer, is you right click on that adjustment layer and you go to create clipping mask. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it so that this adjustment layer only affects the layer immediately below it, which is our layer 2 copy. So also if you right click on it, you can release the clipping mask. So again, you select the adjustment layer, you right click, create clipping mask, and now you can see as I adjust the exposure, it's only affecting the person or the layer that's immediately below it. So now that I've done that, what I can do is I can group these together. So I can call this guy shadow. Okay, so now I have his shadow, and the group, with the group selected, I can do Control T to transform. And this time I'm going to use this distort tool. So if I right click on him while I have the transform option enabled, I can right click and I can click on distort, and this is just going to allow me to really adjust his shape in a number of ways, so you can kind of see how that's playing out. It just takes a little bit of experimentation to sort of understand how you're dragging certain points is going to affect the person. So it takes a little bit of messing around to kind of figure it out. As you can see there, that looks pretty good for that to be his shadow. So The next thing you want to do is his shadow is totally black right now, and we want it to be you know, slightly see-through, right, because it's not totally black. So we can change the opacity of the layer. You can see here that's an option. If you select any of these layers, they have an opacity to them, and so we can just set that opacity to, let's say, 50%, and now you can start to see some of the objects that are below him, or some of the other details that are below or underneath his shadow. So the next thing you need to do is move his shadow below, right? Because right now you can see his shadow on top of his pant leg, because it's above, that layer is above the layer of the person. So we're just going to move that layer below, and that fixes that issue. And then probably lastly, you'll just want to group the layer which has his shadow and the layer of the actual person. Just group those together so that they always stay together. I'll call this purple guy. So you can see that there. So you do that for all these people, or at least the ones where you can actually see their shadow. So these guys, we definitely will see their shadow, so we'll just do this real quick. Exposure, create clipping mask. And we're going to group these. Transform, right click, distort, and move their shadows down. That sometimes the making of shadows can be a bit tricky with multiple people. You just kind of have to do your best here to make it look realistic, and you want to match the angle of the shadows of different people. So just get that sort of as good as we can get it there, and we'll group these guys. So just like that, adding shadows. You'll want to do this to the trees as well. So you'll give the trees shadow, have them cast a shadow onto the scene as well. And it's the exact same process. So if I was to do it for a tree, let's take this big tree for example. So I can duplicate this tree. First use the exposure, create clipping mask, drop the exposure down, then I can group these, transform and distort, and lay the shadow down. Just like that. I won't do it for all of these because that's going to take too much time, but so that's the general idea there for that. So you can see it looks much more realistic with them casting shadows there. Okay, so that's generally it for the compositing. Of course, you can add as much information as you want. Sometimes in urban settings you'll have cars, buses, airplanes, helicopters. In this one we might have other animals. We might also have or see the huts that are sort of behind the building, or the Stonehenge, depending on the angle that you're taking. And of course you can composite those images into this Photoshop file in exactly the same way as I've shown you here. You just open it in a new tab, drag it or cut it out and drag it into this Photoshop file, and then use the layer mask to remove information and blend it into the scene.